Thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm Catherine Stothart. I'm the Director of Events for BAPT, as I think most of you know. This is a members only webinar that we're making available to members of the American APT and the Australian APT as well. So it's good to see people from USA and various parts of Europe here. So welcome. This is the third in a series of webinars. The first one was back in September with David Hodgson talking about parents and type and teenagers. Then we had Angelina Bennett last month talking about ego developments. And this month, Jerry is going to take us into a very important area, which is how to use type ethically. I can't see the screen sharing, but I assume that people can see Jerry's slide. Yeah, I've got some nods and thumbs up. Brilliant. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jerry. So welcome to this session. I'm delighted to introduce Jerry. Jerry Gilpin is a board member for BAPT. He's the board secretary. And as many of you may know, he's a qualified coach, coaching supervisor, facilitator and consultant, and lives in Bristol. He's been quite instrumental in getting us in BAPT to clarify our values, which has been a really helpful process that we've gone through. And those values are to be accessible, inclusive, sustainable and ethical. So it's quite appropriate really that Jerry is leading this session for us tonight. So thank you, Jerry, for taking this on for us, and over to you, Jerry.
Great. Thank you. Well, welcome again, everybody. Really nice to see you. And actually, it's quite nice to have a group of, 13 people or something like that, because hopefully that will give us enough time to talk to one another. Plenty of breakout group time as we go through today. So thank you for putting the time aside. Let's plunge in. If I can now make my slides work. Yes, here we are. So just to clarify why we're here and what I think we're doing, hopefully it'll align with what you think we're doing. So firstly, simply to increase awareness of ethical issues around type together. And I'll explain a bit more obviously about that as we go through. But just raising the profile of a discussion about ethics, I think, is important. And if we do nothing else, that at least having focused on that for an hour and a half tonight, we'll do that. Secondly, and as part of that, the specific way of doing that is to raise familiarity with the BAPT model, or the sort of statement that we've put together, which we are not putting out there as the sort of type police or anything, saying this is the way to do it, it's the only way you can think ethically about type. We're certainly not trying to say that, but there is, we have got a little short statement which we'll share with everybody, and we'll talk through, or I'll talk through as we go through tonight. And just getting familiar with that model is also one of the aims for this evening. I think also it's a chance to just practice thinking on a values or ethics basis as well. So a number of you, like me, are coaches or consultants and work with organizations. And certainly I find it incredibly useful with organizations to take their values and to actually say to them, well, what do they mean in practice? And what are they actually going to look like? And how would you know if people weren't actually adhering to those values? So that's the way we're going to be thinking tonight. And so if you're not used to thinking in that kind of way, this might give you a model that you can also roll out and think about using in different ways in different organizations. And then finally, there's also an aim here about simply connecting with other practitioners and building community. And I think actually a conversation like this around ethics is a really natural way of doing that, because as I say, we're not trying to put ourselves up as the type police or anything. We all have experience of using type in different ways, and therefore we can all have a view together. Each of us has something really valuable to say in the conversation tonight, and that hopefully will build that sense of connectedness and relationship for us as members of BAPT or as members of the global type community. So those are our aims, and I hope they're not 100 miles from what you were expecting. So in terms of just building connections, I'd like us to spend a few moments in breakout rooms thinking about very simple things. So when we go into the breakout rooms, if you'd like to share your name and your role, if you have a particular role that you'd like to, I mean, I would just say coach and facilitator probably, and a little bit about your type history. So, you know, maybe when you first encountered type and, you know, why you use it or where you use it. Secondly, why you came to this webinar. And then thirdly, one question that you have about type and ethics. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to think about those questions before I ask Catherine to put us into rooms. And these will be entirely random rooms. And I don't know, Catherine, whether you'll be in one, but I'm very happy to be in one just to say hi. And we'll just be there for 5 minutes. So let's give it 30 seconds silence, and then Catherine put us into rooms, if you would. So hopefully you've all had a chance just to get to know each other a little bit. And I just wanted to give a chance to say, are there one or two questions that came up in that, so that last question there in the conversation that would be valuable for us to know? So questions that about type and ethics?
There weren't any specific questions from our group. I think just more a general interest in what ethics means in typology, and just some comments about mistyping people can be very dangerous.
Yeah.
So it's so important to get it right.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
I think, well, there was one question in my group. I exited from it, so they didn't hear it. My question is that actually, as practitioners, that we've got various aspects of type available to us, and how the decision gets used as to which aspect, whether it be temperament or interaction style or MBTI, and how much the client, if I use that term, is involved in that. I think for me, there's a bit of an ethical issue about, do I do something because that's something I particularly like, as opposed to what's best for the client.
Yeah, so knowing what's best for the, or feeling that you know what's best for the client, when perhaps being more collaborative.
Being
interesting.
Yeah, being ethical about that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And anything else from another group, perhaps?
So we talked about how to resist stereotyping.
Yeah.
And the question of the way that type that can be represented on the internet and in social media came up as well. This the sort of cartoon. I'm using that term, but this kind of the ways that we can put expectations or limitations on others in this dialogue.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll certainly come back to that one, and it's good to have those issues being sort of bubbling up already for us. So thank you for that.
I think that was,
sorry, was there?
I was just going to say, I think that in our group we talked about how we had been trained with very clear ethical guidelines about how to use type, but we feel that we were talking about how control has been lost, and particularly with the internet and 16 personalities, it's really very hard to put the put the baby back in the, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So again, I'm sure that's something we'll come back to. So thank you all very much. Great. So I must remember how to do this. There we are. So I just wanted to set this in context, which Catherine did a little bit earlier on, about the conversations that as a board we had in 2020, because we're thinking about how we should be taking back forward as a board, as a little group of volunteers trying to kind of steer this little organization into the future. So when we were doing that, we came up with this sort of four-sided model, if you like, that we wanted BAPT to be accessible. In other words, that it should be open to everyone with an interest in type globally, if we could make it so. And in some ways, the pandemic has really helped with that, because here we are tonight with a lovely connected little group across the world. So accessible to people across the world, certainly, but also to people who have a very perhaps different set of experiences around type, people who use different type models, and there are more and more type-based models around, as we all know at the moment. and therefore also inclusive of those different approaches. So rather than saying, well, you know, you can't join BAPT unless you're MBTI qualified or something, but rather than that, trying to say actually the interest in psychological type is an increasingly broad field, and we want the conversation to be in the room, as it were. We want to be providing the room for that conversation as much as we possibly can. So accessible, inclusive. Clearly, as a board, we need to make the organisation sustainable. So that's about putting on the right webinars that people are interested in. It's about the conference maybe providing the input that people are looking for. It's about being able to pay the bills and that kind of stuff. But then the fourth line on this pitch, if you like, was the ethical line. And we felt it was really important, without turning ourselves into the type police, to be standing for a use of type that was ethical and was interested in the kind of questions that you've just been raising about the appropriateness of how we use type, about mistyping people or resisting stereotyping, and trying to encourage people to think ethically. So the intention for us is that BAPT should occupy that space in the middle somewhere, where we are accessible, inclusive, sustainable, and ethical. And so tonight is really focusing on that left-hand side and thinking about, well, what's on the pitch, as it were, ethically, and what's off the pitch. What should we perhaps together be saying is good ethical practice, and are there things that we can identify that really we'd want to question in our own practice or in the practice of others? So as we looked at that together, we worked to try and come up with these three ethical principles, which I'll put up to here. And some of you will know that my background is as a Church of England priest, and some of you will know that in preaching, very often it's a nice habit to come up with 3 points that all begin with the same letter. So that's what we did here. We came up with person. So a focus on the person, preference, and this is about language and using the language of preference, and then thirdly, practice. So person, preference, practice, and that third one's about putting type into practice. So there were kind of 3 broad areas that we were looking at here, and we were working, as you always do, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. So we had these conversations, very aware, particularly of quite a lot of work that Susan Nash and Linda Behrens had done in about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. But then sort of refining that into a model that we felt was a comfortable one for us to be talking about in meetings like this. So here, if we think of this time of a triangular playing pitch rather than a square one, so we're thinking about focusing on the person, using the language of preference, and putting type into practice, and creating therefore an ethical space for type in the center of that. So if we can hold to those 3 principles, we reckon that will be a way of understanding what ethical practice might be for us. So first of all, then, that first line, we're just going to take each of these 3 sides in turn and think in a little bit more detail about each, and then there'll be a chance in breakout rooms to talk about what good practice might look like, and also, in some ways, perhaps more importantly, what bad practice might look like, because then we can learn to identify that. So first of all, focus on the person. And again, under each element here, there are 3 sort of subsections. So that focus on the person, the first thing that we felt was important to say there was that it's the individual who determines their best fit type. It's not us who type them, who come along with a doctor's white coat and stethoscope and prod them and say, aha, INTJ in my case. All the instruments that we use are simply indicators, and MBTI, of course, the clue is in the name. It's the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So that's all they are. They're an indication of the right kind of questions to be exploring rather than a definition. And therefore, the practitioner's role is to help the client to clarify that best fit type using lots of different data points. Yes, an instrument, almost certainly of some kind, or a structured way into talking about type, a framework, perhaps the conversation between the client and the practitioner. There may well be reading that we would encourage them to do, reflection on lived experience, paying attention. I was working with somebody this afternoon, and at my second coaching meeting with him, and we'd looked at type in the first one, and he said, actually, just the awareness of my type has been a huge learning over the last 3 weeks, because I've actually calibrated my experience alongside that type and said, oh, okay, no wonder I find that stuff difficult. And that's, I'm sure, a story that all of us could replicate many times. But it is about, not just about, you know, him working through a process with me in that first meeting. Much more important that he's constantly reflecting, and he is beginning to say, yeah, I see how this set of preferences is an accurate reflection of who I am as a person. So the second point under focusing on the person is that all type preference combinations are equally valuable. I should have asked Catherine about 5 minutes ago to share a link to the statement in the document. I just can see 1 or 2 people scribbling things down frantically. A document is coming away in the chat, which puts all these words down on a piece of paper, so you don't need to write everything down. So the second point about focusing on the person is that these different, any combinations are equally valuable. So our type descriptions need to be balanced, non-judgmental, and free of stereotypes. So that was something that you'd already kind of raised in your initial group conversation, that the tendency towards stereotyping. And it's something that I'm very aware of. You know, I've worked with type for nearly 20 years, I suppose, and it's so easy to slip into that, and so easy to slip into saying, well, of course, with your ENTJ preferences, no surprise that. While I understand why I end up doing that sometimes, it always doesn't quite, you know, doesn't quite sit right, and I try and pull it back a little bit afterwards. And recognizing the upsides and downsides, therefore, of each preference combination. That topic quite often, I think, comes up when you're talking about career choices with people, and the way in which people recognize that the context they're working in may not be obviously friendly to their type. But there are things that they're bringing to that context which are unique to them as individuals and to their type, and that is a really valuable contribution, even if it doesn't fit the main, and perhaps particularly if it doesn't fit the main context and cultural stereotypes that they're working within. And then thirdly, the individual exists in that broad context. So this focus on the person also includes the fact that actually we're very different because of our culture, whether that's a family culture, a social one, national one, because of our gender, our sexuality, our race. Everything else influences who we are as people and the way in which our type may have developed. And that unique personal history, even beyond that, the fact that we moved house, you know, 4 times as you know, before we were 10 or whatever it is, all of those things are going to come in together. So we should be resisting that sense of type being a monolithic thing, and it's always about the person. So that's our first line, as it were, on the pitch. And what I'd like to invite you to do, although I seem to have lost the slide for that, is to, here it is, it's come back, is to go into the groups. And so just for about 6 or 7 minutes, to have a discussion together around this question: when and why might we fail to focus on the person? What might be the pressures, the demands, the context that would mean that we didn't focus sufficiently on the individual when we're having that type conversation? Okay, so Catherine, if I can ask you to put everybody into a group. As I say, there'll be about 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll see you back.
Physically chase you.
Great, good. Well, it's always a good sign when people have come back at the last minute, because it probably means that somebody was saying something interesting that they wouldn't want to leave. So just very briefly, if we come back to this line, just any input from each room, perhaps room, why don't we start with room 1? Anything, I think Paula, you were in there, anything to report back about what would mean that we were not focusing on the person? How would we know?
Well, so there was a really interesting conversation. A few things we covered, but in particular, the pressure on practitioners to be the expert.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So that rather than the person finding out for themselves, like, what do you think? You're the expert. You should know. This sort of pushing it back like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. Room 2, Sarah. That's...
Yeah, that was us, and yes, we had that comment as well, Paula, and also we were talking about the pressure of time. There's the 2 SJs in the room, me being one of them, and it was like, okay, we've got to get this done, get through it. So Renee was using a really lovely expression of it being a journey of discovery. And he said quite a bit about that. That was just really lovely.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nick, room 3.
Yeah, we talked about the usual, labeling someone and putting people in boxes, but some interesting comments around if sometimes you're focusing on the goal rather than the needs of the individual, and then put in some context where in our group there's someone who works mainly with groups, and so there's a potentially neglecting somebody in that group, not paying attention to their needs. But specifically, we also talked about how some companies have used in the past, probably not so much now, I don't know, but some companies have used personality questionnaires to deselect people for jobs, actually to get rid of them, and that has been an unethical use in the past. And we then went on to talk about MBTI. How do they know if you're being unethical? Because with, let's say, the British Psychological Society, you could get reported to the body, and you could lose a license. But with MBTI, that's not. I don't know if that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, it's not a route that BAPT would want to go down. But there are sort of equivalent organisations that would say, actually, you need to be a member of this society, and then you can appeal to that, to the ethical statement of that society, and be struck off or whatever. That's always a possibility, but that's not a place we felt that we wanted to go to, I guess. So a whole raft of things there, and I mean, I've just written up a few as well, which just basically kind of reflect much of what you've been saying, I think. So the problem here, when we're off the pitch, some of the indicators are, what you've said, and I've just put the individual's growth actually being less important than my expertise, or the quality of the model, or the fee that we might earn, and possibly the time pressure and so on. So those are some of the things, and it was great to hear the ones coming up from your groups as well. So if we move on and we think about using the language of preference, well, what does that mean then? Slides have stopped. There we are. Go back one. So the first thing about using the language of preference is to remember that preferences and whole type, which is what we're interested in here, because we're interested in the whole person, are dynamic. They're not static and definitional. So the focus, and ethically, if we're thinking about how we use language around type, needs to be on that interplay of functions within a type, rather than you are an S or an N or whatever it might be. But that sense of a whole type, INTJ in my case, what that might mean for the ways in which I use my intuition or my thinking and my feeling and my sensing. And therefore trying to avoid the labeling use of language. For example, she's a censor, or he's a judger, because those labels are always going to imply a sort of limit, and a sense that actually you're a judger and therefore not a perceiver. Whereas with my INTJ preferences, I'm very clear that my dominant function is a perceiving function. I can do that extroverted thinking and get my slides more or less in order and so on. But actually, I'm not a judger. I'm somebody that relates to the external world using my judging function. So just being a bit more nuanced about that use of language. Secondly, and this may relate to what the group was reporting back about, actually, using this as a selection tool in some way. Preferences are not skills or competencies, and therefore it should never be used for role selection, because all individuals can and do use all the function attitudes. So I might prefer introverted intuition, but I can use extroverted intuition, I can use extroverted sensing, I have to as a human being. So actually selecting and treating preferences as if they were skills or competencies is damaging to that sense of potential growth through the functions that we're looking for as type practitioners for the individual. And then thirdly, preferences are not predictive of behavioral traits. So there are obviously there are overlaps between certain behavioral traits and likely sets of preferences, but the one is not the same as the other. So type is always going to influence behavior, but it doesn't determine it. So it sits underneath behavior, but there'll be a whole bunch of other stuff that will affect our behavior. And rather than saying, oh, you do this because you're a T, that will be part of it, but that's not the only reason. There's also family background or gender or whatever it might be is playing in there as well. And if people want to talk about behavioral traits, let them go somewhere else, essentially to look for instruments that reliably test for behavioral traits, because type is not setting itself up to do that. So there are some principles around the language that we use. And the question, therefore, is the same as we go into groups for a second time. When and why might we fail to use the language of preference? What might push us to be much more static and definitional and to fall off the pitch that we should be playing on? So same groups, pick up your discussion where you left it, but focus this time on the language of preference, and we'll see you back in 5 or 6 minutes.
Great. And we have an extra person who's arrived, Phoebe Clark. Welcome, Phoebe. And I've put you into a group as well. So
Great.
I'm opening
Welcome,
the rooms
Phoebe.
now, everybody.
Recording now. Welcome back, everybody. Really the same sort of process as last time, but let's go the other way around the groups and just see what was coming out in your group discussion. So if we start with room 3 and Nick.
Yeah, so we talked about essentially the pros and cons, and I think the comment was, it's difficult not to label people because it's easy to fall into it, and no one really gets excited by saying, oh, this is my preference. Actually, people really get excited by the fact they are labeled and they can then judge themselves or compare themselves with someone else. That's where the excitement is, if that makes sense. It's very hard to get excited about your preference. And also we talked about it helps people to understand themselves better. We all kind of accept the ethical issues, but it's quite helpful sometimes to help the person understand themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But people do, we did really appreciate the challenges that come with that.
Great, thank you. Sarah, room 2.
Yeah, so we had a really good discussion and just agreed that it is challenging to hold our form as type practitioners and always use the language of preference. It's difficult. And there are and almost kind of being aware that it's difficult, and even having the conversation in the room is useful and helpful, because as Nick has said, it's just too easy to say, right, all the judges, if you've got a room full of people, all the judges over here, all the the senses, and I would challenge anyone who says they've not done that. And just recognizing that that people do like the labels, but to keep that so we came up with a couple of sort of suggestions is to have maybe 2 profiles and say to people, you know, there will be things that resonate with you on both profiles. So just continue to work through it, and it's a work in progress and that kind of thing. And to try as well to, if you're working with a group, it's easier, I think, to run exercises that demonstrate the different preferences and swap them about, you know, so that those who say I've got a strong preference for sensing are invited to do an exercise where they use their intuition. And again, that demonstrates that actually everyone is capable of doing this, but kind of where your energy lies and strength and so on.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sarah, and room 2. So, and then back to room 1 and Paula.
So we talked about the fact that the language of preference can be a little clunky. So it can be a bit of it can sound a bit long-winded or a bit. I don't know. We didn't use the word pedantic, but maybe it sounds that way to be rather than the simpler language of you are this or you are that. There was also a point made there as well about that it's not necessarily a hard conversation. There was a feeling that in the opening contracting, there's an opportunity to get people comfortable with the idea that this is how we're going to talk about it, and then to bring people back. But certainly the sense that that there's a certain sophistication around getting comfortable with preferences as opposed to just you are this or I am this.
That's helpful as well. Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. We're working our way around, and 1 or 2 suggestions that I've just put up here, and they've really all been covered, I think. So we know we're off the pitch, as it were, when we get at least stuck in the language of labeling and categorization and limitation, and treating preferences as if they were behaviors. So it's just I guess getting sort of sensitive to that as an issue is the ethical piece here, isn't it? Rather than getting it right every time, because we won't get it right every time. But actually, you know, if you hear yourself say to a group something that you think afterwards, oh gosh, I was really labeling there, you know, next exercise you can make a bigger effort to kind of modify that language and so on. So it's not about saying that we need to get everything right all the time. It's about awareness of the issues and being able in the moment to be, as it were, flexible, nimble, to address the issues that are coming up, even as we talk type with people. So fine, our last side of the pitch, our 3-sided pitch, is about putting type into practice. So we have person, preference, and practice. So the 3 points for us here under putting type into practice. This is about how we model type, all of this. So this is about our own behavior and our choice of language and our use of examples. For example, one could, with INTJ preferences, and I have internally, I hope I haven't done it very much, if at all, externally, say, well, of course, you can't expect me to always pay attention to those details. But actually, and of course, sometimes I'll slip into that and I won't notice something. So I like to be really early for meetings. Occasionally, I'll turn up really late because I didn't properly look at the map. But rather than going into that and saying, oh, well, I'm really sorry, but because of my INTJ preferences, that leads me to not always pay attention to the data. Rather than that, to model an ethical approach to the way in which we talk about our own type, and also the ethical approach to intellectual property and copyright. So we're actually, the way we behave as type practitioners, we're not nicking other people's bits and pieces and sticking them together. Or if we are doing that, we're seeking permission to do it and saying, as I did at the start of this, that actually a lot of this thinking was based on something that someone else had done. So we're not sort of owning it in a way that is wrong. So, and that's all part of our own behavior and choice of language and use of examples. Secondly, putting type into practice means, however grey some of those lines are that we will come up with tonight, it does mean standing for an ethical use of type rather than just an any old use of type. So refusing perhaps to facilitate type in ways and contexts which don't adhere to the principles that we're talking about tonight. So I remember quite a few years ago now being contacted by quite a large size organization that said, well, we're selecting people for our top team. Will you take a group of 10 people through type as part of that? And you know, I had to say, well, no, I won't, and and to explain why, because that simply wasn't an appropriate use of type. So that's about, in a sense, holding to the other lines of the triangle that we're talking about here. Second thing that we felt was important in standing for an ethical use of type was actually trying to be ethical about, you know, keeping type education front and center for ourselves, and to have some kind of annual CPD to develop best practice in the use of type. So we're not sort of thinking, well, we've done that and we don't never need to think about type again. Even coming to this conversation tonight and taking part in that would count, wouldn't it, as a way of just raising our awareness about some of these areas of type practice. And then thirdly, of course, that in the end, that might mean calling out a tendency to use type to manipulate or stereotype or to other people. Evelyn, you've got your hand up. Do you want to put in a question or comment here?
Question. I don't recognize the acronym CPD, so could you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Continuous professional development.
Continuous.
Sorry, I
that
hadn't
makes
realised
sense.
that's maybe
Thank you.
a UK acronym. So thank you for asking. So yeah, that final point, yeah, just that actually, if it comes to it, we do need probably to be able to stand up and say, you really shouldn't be doing it like this, or to question a fellow practitioner and say, is that really the best way? Is that really an ethical way of using type? And then thirdly, about modeling the use of type as a tool in the larger endeavor of human development. This takes us right back to the first point under focusing on the person. Because as Renee was saying in that group and was reported back, the journey, it is a journey, it begins with understanding type. It doesn't end with understanding type. So it's not like you get your 4-letter type and go away and you're done. That's a starting point for your development. And as practitioners, putting type into practice is about the way in which we use type ourselves for our own development, but then also that we model that and we express it and we work with clients continuously, rather than feeling that, and I've noticed this sometimes in my own practice, that I could do type at the start of a set of coaching conversations and then sort of forget to refer back to it after 3 or 4 meetings. And actually, I've occasionally got to the end of a series of meetings and somebody said in the feedback, that type stuff at the beginning was great. Why didn't we do more of that? So, and I think probably there I missed a trick, and I wasn't actually thinking of type in the right way as a part of the constant development of a person that will, no, it's not like we need to refer everything to type, but that it's constantly there and we refer back to it as part of a person's development and of our own development. And that finally, as I say, just bringing us round to this where we started, that our primary calling is to facilitate the individual's growth. And this is a model, one model amongst many perhaps, but this is a model that we're using for that purpose and for no other. So, final bit of conversation. If I can get my slide to go forward. When and why might we fail as individuals to put type into practice in these ways? So once more, 6 minutes or so in those groups, and we will call you back together and see what you think. Great, so welcome back everybody. Sorry to interrupt your conversations, but we're trying to keep everybody on track so they can go and have supper or lunch or whatever it is afterwards. So when and why might we fail to put type into practice is our question this time. I think this time we should definitely start with room 2, and just to ask if there's anybody there. I mean, Sarah's probably ready to feedback, but maybe somebody else would like to jump in and do it. So, but room 2 anyway. We don't want to censor out any other voices, but what were you thinking in room 2?
We picked up on some of the sort of contractual arrangements and wording that we would want to put in place so that we're protecting ourselves, making it clear around what we will and wouldn't share, and also that the importance of keeping it a fun experience, and that we should be, you know, making all of the types have a positive descriptor, which can sometimes be harder than others. So it's mainly about that, and making sure that, you know, people know that we're doing it ethically. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks so much. So room 1, similarly, anybody want to chip in from room 1? If nobody does, then I'm sure Paula will.
Sounds like I might be up.
I think you're up, Paula.
So we had there are 2 things that are off the top of my head. One was there was a comment made about if a person with a type has a particular type preference, there might be a tendency to think, oh, I know somebody else who identifies with that preference, and I like them or I don't like them, or they behave like this or they behave like that, and sort of have that stain this person in front of you. And we talked a little bit too about the use of always and never, and how that pushes us into unhelpful stereotyping.
Yeah, which that's really helpful. That's another language issue, actually, isn't it? That always and never stuff. I mean, that's a bit of a watchword for coaching and working with people generally, when those words creep in, isn't it? Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And room 3?
I was in room 3, but just checking whether Phoebe or Sarah want to say anything, but no, all right.
You're up next. Sorry, thank you.
All right. So yeah, we again had a really rich conversation. Lots of things we're talking about, but people really like the interesting about contracting. That idea of contracting with the client as a really good way to bring the ethical conversation back into the conversations. It's really, yeah, if you ever said, you know, that's something we'd like to do in our work with groups and individuals. We then talked about, because just being conscious about what you're doing and setting that standard. But the sort of conversation we had that was really interesting is that we looked at it from people who challenge personality questionnaires, like scientists and engineers, who say, well, this is unproven, and you know, no one believes this, it's all fantasy, whatever. But we always say to people, look, that the human mind hasn't been cracked, right? This is just, we loved what you said about it's there to facilitate individual growth, right? About self-awareness, and people shouldn't think that it's going to crack their mind. We're not going to crack their mind, but it's a tool to help you understand yourself. So we really like that idea of facilitating individual growth, and just selling that to people, and not to get too focused on MBTI itself, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's really helpful. Great, thank you all. And it sounds like you've been having great conversations. So just some suggestions to put alongside that and duplicate what you've said, perhaps in many cases, but it's the issue of not walking the talk, isn't it? Excusing ourselves, compromising standards where we kind of know that it's not ethical, stagnating as well in terms of our own practice, perhaps, and forgetting that we too are on a journey, and this is about our own growth. And then losing seriousness and losing humor, both of them in a way. So if we stop being serious about type and thinking that there's further understanding that we can engage with, there's further development, that's a bit of a danger sign in terms of not walking the talk, but also losing a sense of humor about it, and becoming too sort of almost Puritan about our approach to type. because it is meant to be, you know, part of that growth to fulfillment for all of us, and that should feel like it's positive, and you know that humor is part of that, I think, rather than something we need to keep to one side. So here we are, our ethical space. Focus on the person, use the language of preference, and put type into practice. And that hopefully will create for us an ethical space for type to exist in our practice as coaches or facilitators or therapists or whatever we might be. So there's our theory and our model and a bit of discussion around it. The last thing that I think it would be helpful for us to do before we come to a close is to say, well, okay, that's all very well. It's easy to talk about principles, and I love talking about principles. But the next time I use type, what? So when is the next time do you expect to use type? Which of those three principles, which one do you think you might focus on as you think about that opportunity to use type in development or teamwork or whatever it might be? And then, and then finally, how will I know if I've played on the pitch in that particular time, that next time that I expect to use type? So we're going to go back into groups for, again, just 5 minutes or so, but I want to give you a minute this time to think about this, because you might need to actually have a look at your diary and see when's the next time I'm using type, and actually to sort of think back over the discussions that we've had tonight and to say, well, which one principle feels like it's the warmest one for me at the moment? And as I think about that specific opportunity to use type, how will I know in that situation if I've played on the pitch? So let me give you a minute to think, and then, or Catherine, if you'd like to give us a minute to think, and then put us into groups for, again, just 5 minutes. And then we will be finished by 7:30. I will pause the recording at this point, and then Catherine, when you're ready, put us into those groups again. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. So we're coming to a close of the time that we've got together, and we are firm about not going beyond that time. But rather than going around the rooms this time, just felt it'd be nice to throw this question open. Anybody would like to respond and put into the pot what they were talking about, and any reflections they've got about how they might approach their next type engagement in an ethical way.
I've got a big group next month, and I'm definitely going to be focusing on the language of preference. I think that they all have challenges, but to really play in that pitch, for me, the language of preference. Lovely. Thank you, Sarah. That's great.
I think I'm definitely going to use the contracting at the beginning of my group sessions. And we had a good conversation in our group about, you know, if you kind of, sometimes it's difficult getting a rapport with your group, you know, if they're all a particular type and you're, you know, because you're not an engineer or whatever, sort of throwing it back at them rather than trying to explain it, say, well, what do you think? You know, you tell me, you know, and sort of asking questions rather than trying to, you know, explain it when they want to see you dig yourself into a big hole sometimes, you know. Yeah. And that I mean, in a way, that's partly about using humor and pushing it back to them, isn't it? Yeah, and keeping it light rather than feeling like you're being trapped in that expert. Well, like you get defensive, that's never going to work. Yeah,
exactly. Thank you, Sarah. Any other reflections, intentions? Great. Well, thank you for being part of this and being part of the conversation. It's been lovely to be here with you for this time and to be thinking about this ethical space for type that hopefully we're constantly creating and recreating as practitioners. So let me go back to this again. Here we are. So yes, thank you for being part of it, and thank you for the conversations that you've had in those rooms and the connections that you made with one another. Just wanted to flag up the fact that we have this type practitioner peer support that Sarah, our president, runs, and that might be a great place as a forum for discussing some of these ethical issues. So there should be a kind of natural lead-in to that, but whether or not you do it through that form, please do stay in touch and help us to make BAPT as accessible and inclusive and sustainable and ethical as we can going forward. So thank you once again. I'm just going to hand it back over to Catherine to finish us right off before 7:30.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. The most important thing I've got to do actually is thank Jerry for running today's session. I've certainly enjoyed, clap from everybody. I've enjoyed listening to your outputs, and that thing about contracting is something that's going to stick in my mind. So thank you ever so much, Jerry, for tonight. This slide is just a quick reminder of all the other events we've got on, including, of course, our conference in April, but also the In Conversations with Rich Thompson of the Myers-Briggs Company and James Johnston, the Gifts Compass person. So we've got lots on. Please come along, please join in, please participate so we can make this a really vibrant community for everybody. So, I've just managed to finish within the time. Thanks very much, everybody. Jerry and I will stay on this call if anybody does want to stay on, but if not, thanks very much for coming tonight, and lovely to see you all, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye everybody.
Thank you.
Great section. Bye everyone.